Oh. Thank you and hello. Bit nervous with the mic, so please bear with me. And thank you very much for the invitation to come today. It's the first time I've spoken to this group. Just before I launch, has anyone here also attend the governance meetings networks? You're okay, Candy. You may have heard my jokes before, so please laugh politely if I come across them again. You may have seen this presentation previously. A little bit more. Thank you. So yes, firstly, let me also introduce our new Commissioner, two people here in the room. Sharon O'Neill, previously the Director General of the Department of Education, joined us as our Commissioner only a matter of a couple of months ago in July. 12 years running a department of 40,000 plus people, and on a good day the Public Sector Commission's about 120. She's running us ragged and we're enjoying trying to keep up with the pace she's setting. There is a limited intersection between the Public Sector Commission. We are a state government independent statutory authority is the official title. Our Commissioner reports directly to Parliament, although we do have a Minister. Her direct line of report is to Parliament. And we have only a limited interaction, like I said, with local government through the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which some people may know as the Whistleblowing Act. Good to see a few nods, because most people are like, what? We have one in WA, and you're covered as local government. And also the Corruption, Crime and Misconduct Act. We have interaction with local government sector in that place. I know we're talking to the Finance Network today, but you'll be pleased to know fraud is not the only kind of misconduct that public officers are engaging out there. So I'm going to run through some of the broader, higher level categories of misconduct to get a bit of a feel for where your integrity risks are. And unfortunately, if we're talking misconduct, dollars are always going to be a temptation, so it does crack a mention. One of the big changes in the Corruption, Crime and Misconduct Act on the 1st of July 2015 was to introduce a definition for misconduct. Can I see a show of hands? Has anyone been involved in having to notify on behalf of their authority through to the CCC? Yep. Previously, under the old CCC Act, misconduct was one word and it was one basket, and they were inundated from everything, I guess, from stationery theft all the way through to the serious sorts of corruption and misconduct that have been taking the front pages of the West Australian over the last few weeks across public sector, local government, public universities, as well as the government trading entities. It's huge. We total in about close to 200,000 as a group of people that are covered by this Act, and everyone in this room is a public officer for the purposes of that Act. I might also add your subcontractors and contractors that are delivering services on behalf of your local government are also considered public officers if they are in a position where they're operating under a written law or they're providing services on your behalf. Probably not the Keep Australia Beautiful Council that come in and do a busy bee once a year, not them, but you'll know the sort of people that contract to you. Volunteers as well, if anyone has volunteer fire brigade people, they operate under the Fire Brigades Act, so they, for their purposes, are considered to be public officers. So it's quite huge. 200,000 is what we've got as an approximate fixed full-time equivalent, but it actually probably involves headcount, quite a few more. But just even eyeballing the pie chart there, you can see that local government is that burnt orange sort of colour. It's about 12% of the overall population, I guess, of people covered under the Act. That's handy to note when we start to actually have a look at the sort of matters that are reported to us. The CCC has maintained and retained notification and reports of serious misconduct. That's where there's a corruption, a deliberate intent, and some of those sort of actions that we saw play out in the North Metro Health reports and news items that have been hitting the airwaves in the last 2 weeks. A deliberate intent to use your position to advantage or to detriment someone else. Or during the course of your work, you get involved in a crime or an offence that does incur a jail penalty of 2 years or more. Who has time to do that? Everyone else is so busy at work, but there are people who are actively out there and engaging in misconduct. CCC still gets to deal with them. The Public Sector Commission takes matters that are known as minor misconduct, and don't be confused. I don't think minor is all that minor for the purposes of the Act. It still needs to be improper, dishonest conduct, a breach of trust, and that could be by the community loses faith in you or your CEO, misuse of information, resources, and has the potential of terminating your employment on reasonable grounds. So a bit of a thumbnail sketch there of the definition, Section 4 for the legal beagle nerds in the room, CCM Act, Section 4. So under that, the Public Sector Commissioner, we primarily look at employees is our big grab bag. I will note, councillors, elected members, there is no jurisdiction for the PSC. Because of who they are as elected members, any of their involvement is considered serious. And it's the same as police and people working as public servants for the police department. Any allegation of misconduct goes straight to the CCC, just as a note. So, we've got the last 2 years reporting here with the first year of 16-17, the previous last one. 534 matters were received across all sectors of minor misconduct by us. And it went up about, up to 599 there, went up about 10% in 2017-18. Interesting, there's 2 bar lines there, or 3, but I'll talk about the first 2. I'm not an accountant, I still count in 2s and 3s. The principal officer, your CEO, has a paramount obligation under the CCM Act to notify of misconduct. As soon as they turn their mind to thinking there is misconduct and it could likely lead to a discipline process that could lead to reasonable grounds of termination, we expect a notification. Also under the CCM Act, anyone can make a report of misconduct. So that can be employees that are working alongside people, see something and know something's not quite right and might choose to make a report, or it can be members of community, ratepayers and residents. And I must say we are getting to know your ratepayers and residents fairly well. My team in the integrity promotion area look after the advisory line, and I think if I said we are not a complaint-taking agency under the CCM Act, what we do take is reports of misconduct. You can be sure I wouldn't be here, I'd be on a holiday now if I could get $1 for every time I'd say that. The difference being, and it's very clear, we have no role to resolve complaints or bring about an outcome of if someone's dissatisfied for a service. We totally look at the behaviour of public officers and it needs to meet that definition under the Act. So be assured we do try and hit with the old flat back, just dead it, if we are not another avenue for complaint. Of course, that doesn't stop some people from trying to get the matter across our desk, but we're pretty good at keeping it separate. So when we pull apart those figures and just look at local government for the last 2 years, what we can see is that there has been an increase both in the notifications coming through by your CEOs and reports from members of community and employees. So overall, from 100, bang on 100 matters received in 16-17 up to 163 for this last complete year. What I will say is it's interesting, the differences in the sectors. Public sector generally, we find it's about 80% of our matters referred to us, to us, come from the CEO, and about 20 are reports. Local government, you are so much more closer to the 50-50 with the CEOs and the reports. Any ideas why you think that might be the case? We kind of think it's because of the level of service that you provide, literally to people's front doors. You're so much more connected to community and delivering that service. You also tend to live and work closely in the same area. I can be anonymous walking down St George's Terrace, but I'm sure people in the room here, you don't even need to be in your uniform for people to know on the weekend when you bump into them that you work for the Shire. and they know that you work for council. So it's that heightened level and visibility we think that's driving this. But I'm happy for your thoughts if you've got some other ideas. Then as we find out, if people are engaged in misconduct, it's generally not just one thing. They're having a go at a couple of things as well. So sometimes one matter might give rise to 2 or 3 allegations, different types. And again, what we've found out of that 163 odd matters that we received, there were 316 separate allegations of misconduct involved. And we've had a look. You can see the graph, and apologies if it's a little bit too far, although I'm better at reading that one than I am the one right in front of me here. So the WA public sector, you can see, is the bar right on the far left. The two just went down a smidge, but nothing significant in those sort of stats. Local government, there was a spike this last year, up to 316 allegations. Public universities, huge spikes. If you're into stats, from 10 up to 65, that's almost, what, a 500% increase? But again, still a handful, relatively small numbers. And the GTEs, the government trading entities, had a huge drop. That's just interesting. Data tells you where to look. I'm not quite sure what the story is it's trying to tell us there. But for local government, the rise in allegations is interesting in as much that, remember going back to the first bit, there's about 12% of the total jurisdiction is local government, but you're accounting for almost 30% of the allegations. Again, any thoughts, and I know this is probably the first time for many of you that have seen these stats, does that feel right? Does that feel intuitive to sort of business? That's okay, I'll leave you with it. So we had a go at trying to categorise what the misconduct is, what people are engaged in, or what, trying to categorise it a little bit just to help, because if you can identify it, then you've got halfway through to try and work out how to deal with it. The first 2 columns, and again, apologies if they're a bit hard to read, you will be getting a copy of the slides sent out with the minutes from the meeting and the professional development day today. Without doubt, personal behaviour is always the big one. And I think that just comes about from the fact that no matter what business activity we're engaged in, it's still people, we're still people, and it can actually just be categorised very loosely into someone just made a really poor decision. Knowing what's expected of them and knowing their role, they've still chosen to do something different. But for local government, a big jump in personal behaviour. We'll have a look at that in a bit of more detail. Because it's such a large number, we tried to tease it out a little bit. Majority of these are ones that can be attributed to a breach of your code of conduct. So they tend to be around the way people behave and how they work with each other and their general behaviour in the workplace. Another one, and this is an indication of us getting to know your residents and ratepayers a little bit more, there were 43 that we could easily identify as either not being related to a public officer or it just doesn't meet the category for misconduct for the purposes of the Act. And some people will pepper their complaint or their report with words like misconduct, corrupt, but when you tease it apart and have a look at it, really what it is they're just dissatisfied with the planning decision, or they didn't like the fact that, maybe they liked 4 metre high trees instead of 5. That side of it. So we're pretty good at actually starting to discern what's a complaint and what's actually related to minor misconduct. And for those of you in the room, similar age to me, that remember Countdown and the charts at the end of the night and the song with the bullet, for us, use of public resources for us is a bit of a bullet. What I think this demonstrates is that we're just probably more attuned to what public resources are, and our community are getting more aware that the public resources that you have in order to provide a service, they've kind of paid for somewhere along the line, and they're usually pretty quick at telling us if we're not using them appropriately. It's something that's very clear and obvious in their mind, and we do quite often get the reports around misconduct for that. again, apologies for one of those horrible graphs, but this was our attempt to try and pull apart personal behaviour. Oh, actually, I should have gone back. Sorry, I just will say fraud and corrupt behaviour, fraudulent, because I'm thinking finance fraud is probably of interest. It's pretty steady at 42 to 48 sort of stuff. So it's there, it's always part of it. But even still, I still think there's a personal decision being made there when people engage in fraudulent behaviour. Although the business activity might be financial, it's still them making a poor decision. There was a large spike, but I do need to say that had a lot to do with the way we categorised those sort of reports that came into us about people just not following policy or procedure. And I think it's a case of a maturity of some local governments as well, that there was a clearer line in the sand between identifying a trend in what people knew was expected of them and someone just point blank just failing to act with integrity. The government trading entities, especially people in Horizon Power, Western Power, they treat their health and safety risks as misconduct because there's a very clear policy, you know how to manage this, because the consequences are huge, the voltage that they're dealing with. A breach of policy for them likely leads, in someone engaged in those sorts of high-risk activities, generally leads to a misconduct report to us. So disobeys or regards a lawful order, or whether it's failing to act with integrity, it's all around people being inducted, knowing what's expected of them, understanding what their obligations are under their code of conduct and still just not meeting the grade. So I've pulled a couple of just little vignettes of case studies just to identify those sort of matters that we are seeing coming through from local government. The first one, a rec centre manager allowed his friends and family to access the pool and centre facilities for free when arriving late in the day. Does that seem to sit well with you? That could be a report of misconduct? There's a few nods. Yep. I'm thinking there's probably a revenue angle there. There's probably a health and safety, who's actually in the place. Everyone else has to pay full cop. How come I don't? That side of it. Finding, as we've been getting around regionally, some of the visitor centres owned and operated by the Shire. We had a report come through that some gift items in the Shire's visitor centre were reduced in price without approval. And a staff member called a friends to say those items were on sale now. Hey, you know those... Yeah, you know the bracelets and the necklaces that were done up by the artisan? Discounted now. Can anyone see the misconduct in that? No, you can't see it? You can? No? You would think you'd have a policy of a delegation or who has approval to play with the prices. It's a revenue stream. And it was kind of interesting. We sort of scratched the surface on that one a little bit more, but there was, within this one place, a real sense of entitlement that it was their stock, it was their shop, working away from the main Shire offices, quite autonomous. It's quite an interesting culture. And they were the commercial arm of the Shire, and they were being very entrepreneurial, was some of the comments. Okay. An employee took loads of soil and road base not used on roadworks that day to patch up his driveway instead of taking it back to the depot. There's a few giggles, not pointing fingers. Again, this is one of those realisations of public resources and resources made available to continue the works that you need to provide. I kind of had to ask, does road base go off? Is it potato salad, like if you leave it out of the fridge? Is it... Someone tried to say it was leftover. I'm thinking, well, wouldn't you still just take it back? But then again, there was this sense that it wasn't used. This one came about because a neighbour was out there taking photos. And the employee, when they got back to work, told the CEO, Oh, look, you're likely to get a complaint because the neighbour saw me doing that. Well, yeah, of course, and they may have been waiting and been on the list to have their crossover done, and yet they're seeing someone who is in a position of authority at the local shire just getting it done. And an employee called a colleague in parking compliance to ask if photos of his new boss could be deleted, as it was her first week when she was caught parked in a no stopping zone. Anything wrong with that? Do you have a policy that deals with how employees, if they are get an infringement or a fine? Because I know as Joe Average, if I get caught and I think I've done the right thing and I've taken my photos, I know I can write off to my shire to get my fine reviewed. What happens if you're an employee? Do you have the same option, or is there a separate policy for you to? Should be the same, but it's one of those things that we tend to look at that's probably more of a hint of culture, and again this sense of entitlement that comes about because we just see it as work. But members of community and the ratepayers, taxpayers out there very much see us as their employees and providing a service. Good-o. Well, that was just a short, sharp introduction. Hopefully not too scary if it's the first time you've heard a bit about the Corruption, Crime and Misconduct Act. Have you got any queries? Questions? Yeah, thank you. Do we need a mic?
Thanks very much for that. Nils here from Minginu again. Hey, people at home. Obviously, there's been a big spike from one year to the next. Is that indicative of like a longer term trend? Is it sort of going on a bit of a line like this, or was last year a bit of an outlier? And I guess, sorry, the second part of my question, obviously there's a lot of complaints being brought through, not through the CEO. Are they coming from inside the organisation, from my other officers, or is a majority of the complaint volume now coming from the public?
I'll take your second one first. I think and I don't have the stats here, but the reports, especially in local government, are more external driven. There definitely are still some employees that report through to us, and that's kind of fine. But I think that's more reflective of your sector, that there is a high percentage of external to the agency, which also means they don't always get it right. They don't always have the full picture. And the first one, no, I don't think it was an outlier as such. What I expect over time, as more and more people get comfortable and aware and know about us, because Public Sector Commission, well, we're not the CCC. I'm nowhere near as intimidating as the CCC. And we're the nice people to hear from because we have a very clear role under the Act about prevention and education on misconduct. So I guess today's session is under that banner. I think it's probably just more a case of people being aware. And you will be aware, and there may be some people in the room that have got some particularly vocal ratepayer and residents groups and some big issues that have been driving everyone to the brink. And they in themselves have generated a lot of work for us, not necessarily misconduct when you look at the definition of the Act, but it's still time and it's still accepting of matters and then having to put them to one side and say it's not misconduct for the purposes of the Act. But yeah, it's interesting. I just will finish on, though, although we all like to think we're individuals, as a group, people tend to behave very similarly, and the types of misconduct we see really aren't that much different across the sectors. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.